Sarah Whitmore drove the hammer into the nail so hard the board cracked straight down the middle. Her hands were bleeding. Her back had been screaming for 3 hours. The baby kicked hard against her ribs like a reminder that she had no time to stop. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach, breathed through gritted teeth, and picked up another board. Nobody was coming to help her. Nobody had ever come. And for the first time in her life, that was exactly what she wanted. If this story of a woman who refused to be broken moves something in your chest, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what Sarah Whitmore built with bleeding hands in the summer of 1885 is going to change the way you think about strength forever. The morning Sarah Whitmore arrived in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, she had $43, a worn leather suitcase, a building manual with a broken spine, and a baby due in 11 weeks. She had no husband standing beside her, no family waiting to receive her, no plan that anyone in that town would have called reasonable. What she had was a land deed, 40 acres of scrubland north of town that nobody else had wanted for the better part of a decade, and a quiet burning fury that she kept locked so deep inside her chest that most people never saw it at all. They saw only the exterior, the large frame, the tired face, the belly out in front of her like the whole world could measure her condition at a glance. She felt their eyes the moment she stepped down from the stage. The station master's wife leaned close to another woman and cupped her hand over her mouth. Sarah didn't need to hear the words. She had been reading that particular gesture her entire adult life. A man loading crates nearby, I let his gaze travel over her slowly, the way a rancher sizes up livestock. When their eyes met, he looked away first. Not out of shame, out of disinterest. She had already been categorized, filed away, dismissed. She picked up her suitcase, adjusted her grip on the building manual, and walked toward the livery to ask about a wagon. The man behind the counter, heavy-set, red-faced, with a mustache that had probably been impressive 20 years earlier, looked up from his ledger and blinked. "Help you, miss?" "Ma'am," Sarah said. "And yes, I need a wagon and a driver willing to take me north, about 6 miles. He looked at her belly, then at her suitcase, then back at her face. 6 miles north is nothing but scrub and rock. I know what it is. I own it." He set his pen down. "You own it." "I do. 40 acres. Filed proper with the land office in Cheyenne 3 weeks ago." She set the deed on the counter in front of him, smoothed it flat with one hand. "Now, about that wagon." He read the document slowly, read it again, scratched the back of his neck. Then he said, "I'll take you out. But ma'am, there's no structure on that land. Nothing. You understand that?" "I understand it better than anyone," Sarah said. "That's why I need the wagon." He charged her twice the normal rate. She paid it without argument, because she had learned a long time ago that fighting every small injustice only left you too exhausted to fight the ones that mattered. The land was exactly what the deed had described, and exactly what everyone in Cedar Ridge expected her to run from. 40 acres of rocky ground, sage and silence. A creek cutting along the eastern edge. A stand of pines on the northern rise that would block some of the winter wind if she positioned the cabin right. No road, no well, no floor, no walls. Nothing but sky above and hard earth below, and the sound of her own breathing. The wagon driver, a younger man who had introduced himself as Joel, and who had barely spoken 6 words during the entire ride, set her suitcase and her box of tools on the ground, and looked around with the expression of a man watching someone walk toward a cliff. "I can take you back to town," he said. "No charge." "I won't be going back to town, ma'am." He said it carefully. The way men said it when they were trying to talk a woman down from something without admitting they thought she was unreasonable. "Winter comes hard out here. You're—" He stopped. "I'm what?" Sarah asked. Not angry, just clear. His ears reddened. "You're on your own." "I've been on my own for longer than you'd guess." She picked up the building manual and opened it to the first marked page. "Thank you for the ride, Joel." He hesitated a long moment. Then he climbed back onto the wagon seat. He didn't leave right away. He sat there for almost a minute like he was waiting for her to change her mind. She didn't look up from the manual. He drove away. That first night, she slept in the shelter she'd prepared before leaving a canvas tarp stretched between two pine trunks, staked at the corners with her bedroll and a wool blanket underneath. It was temporary. Everything was temporary. The whole point was to make it permanent. She lay on her back and felt her daughter move. She was certain it was a daughter, had been certain since the beginning, and she placed both palms flat against her stomach in the dark. "I know," she said quietly. "It's not much yet, but give me time." The wind moved through the pines above her. She closed her eyes and went to sleep. She had started planning the cabin in the last month of her marriage when she finally understood what her life had become. Thomas Caldwell was not a cruel man in the way that left bruises. He was cruel in the quieter way, the kind that takes years to recognize because it arrives wrapped in politeness, in provision, in the language of care. He made every decision, not because he didn't trust her judgment, because the idea of her having judgment separate from his had never occurred to him as a possibility worth considering. She had managed the household for 6 years, run the accounts, managed the staff, maintained every social obligation that kept the Caldwell name in good standing in Denver society. She had done it efficiently, completely, without complaint, and Thomas had accepted all of it the way a man accepts air, without noticing, without gratitude, because it was simply what was there. The pregnancy had changed things, not for her, for him. When she told him she was expecting, his first reaction had not been joy. It had been a kind of careful recalibration, like a man reassessing the layout of a room he'd thought he knew perfectly. "You'll need to rest more," he said. "I feel fine." "You'll need to rest more," he said again, as if she hadn't spoken. Within 2 weeks, he had reduced her responsibilities. Within a month, he had eliminated them entirely, delegating everything she had managed to a male secretary he hired without asking her opinion. Within 6 weeks, he had begun making inquiries about sending her to his sister's home in St. Louis, where she could be properly cared for until the baby arrived. She found out about the St. Louis plan, not from Thomas, but from his housekeeper, Mrs. Dunbar, who mentioned it in passing while folding linens, and then went pale when she realized her mistake. Sarah set down the blouse she was holding. "When did he decide this?" Mrs. Dunbar's hands tightened on the sheet. "I shouldn't have. I'm sorry, Mrs. Caldwell, I assumed you knew." "When did he decide this?" 2 weeks ago, ma'am. He's already written to your sister-in-law." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Dunbar," and walked out of the room. She found Thomas in his study. She did not knock. He looked up from his desk with the particular expression he used when she'd done something mildly surprising, not alarmed, not concerned, just faintly puzzled, the way a man looks at a piece of furniture that has shifted slightly from where he left it. "You're sending me to Margaret's," she said. He set down his pen. "I was going to discuss it with you this evening." "You've already written the letter." He was quiet. Then, "It's the sensible choice, Sarah. Margaret has space and her physician is excellent. You'll be properly looked after." "I'm properly looked after here." "You need more than the staff can provide." "I need," she said carefully, "to be consulted before my husband makes decisions about where I will and will not live." Thomas looked at her with that patient expression. The one that said he understood she was upset and that he was willing to wait for her to finish being upset so they could continue. "You're not being sent away," he said. "You're being cared for." "What is the difference?" "Sarah, what is the difference?" "Thomas, because from where I'm standing, both of them end with me going somewhere I didn't choose, to do something I didn't decide for reasons that were decided without me." He folded his hands on the desk. "You're not well." Those 3 words. Not "you're wrong." Not "let's discuss it." Not "I understand your concern." "You're not well." Sarah stood there for a moment, feeling something that had been building for 6 years finally reach its limit. Not rage. Something quieter than rage. Something that had the weight of a decision behind it. "You're right," she said. "I'm not." She walked out of his study. She walked upstairs. She opened her wardrobe and took out the small cash box where she kept the household money. Money she had managed accounted for and stewarded for 6 years. Money that was by law jointly theirs. She counted it. $312. She took half. She took her mother's sewing box. She took the building manual from the shelf in the small reading room that Thomas had never once used. She took a single carpet bag of clothing, and she walked out of the house at 6 in the morning before Thomas or the staff were awake, and she did not look back. She had already looked back enough times. She had spent 3 weeks in Cheyenne before coming to Cedar Ridge. 3 weeks filing the land deed, buying tools, asking questions at the lumberyard, reading the building manual until the pages softened. The man at the lumberyard had tried to talk her into hiring a construction crew. She had listened politely and then asked him to price out the lumber instead. "You planning to build it yourself?" he'd said. "I am." He'd looked at her belly. "When's the child due?" 11 weeks, she said. "Plenty of time to get the walls up and the roof tight before she arrives." He had sold her the lumber. She'd arranged to have it delivered in stages timed to when she'd be ready for each phase of construction. She had planned everything she could plan, knowing that the rest she would have to learn as she went. That was the part Thomas would never have understood. The willingness to not know yet. The ability to stand in the middle of uncertainty and keep moving anyway. He always had to know the outcome before he began. Sarah had stopped needing to know the outcome a long time ago. The first wall went up on the 4th day. It wasn't straight. She measured it, frowned at it, measured it again, and decided it was straight enough. The manual said to get the frame level before worrying about anything else, and she trusted the manual more than she trusted her own anxiety. Her back ached constantly. She drank water more than she thought possible. She took breaks when the baby pushed back against her diaphragm and made it hard to breathe. She ate the dried provisions she'd brought and told herself that the tiredness in her muscles was just evidence that something real was being built. She cried twice that first week. Both times in the evening after the light dropped and she couldn't work anymore. Once because she'd made a mistake with a beam joint that cost her half a day's work to correct. Once because she was tired in a way that went deeper than her muscles. Tired all the way down to something that felt almost like loneliness, except she wasn't ready to call it that yet. Both times, she let herself cry until she was finished. Then she washed her face, ate something, and went to sleep. Cedar Ridge was 6 miles away, and she drove in twice a week for supplies. Both times, she was aware of the way people tracked her progress, or rather the way they tracked her lack of progress in returning to town permanently, which was what they had all been expecting. The women at the general store were polite in the way that has teeth in it. "How are you getting on out there?" the store owner's wife asked the second time Sarah came in. Her name was Martha Hensley, and she had a smile that arrived about half a second before she'd decided whether she meant it. "Getting on fine," Sarah said. "All alone." Martha said it with a small tilt of the head. Concerned, sympathetic, like she was visiting the bereaved. "All alone," Sarah confirmed. "Well," Martha folded her hands on the counter. "You know my husband knows a very good family in Laramie who take in women in your situation. It's no shame at all, and the children are well placed afterward." "I'm not placing my child," Sarah said. Her voice was even. "I'm building her a home." Martha's smile didn't waver. "Of course you are. Of course." She reached under the counter for Sarah's flour. "You just let us know if you need anything." Sarah paid for her supplies and left. She drove back to her land with the provisions stacked in the wagon bed and Martha Hensley's particular brand of kindness sitting somewhere in her chest like a splinter she couldn't quite reach. That afternoon, she put up 2 more framing sections than she'd planned. It was a Thursday morning 3 weeks into construction when she first became aware of someone watching her. She was up on the framing. The walls were taking shape, and she was working on the support structure for the roof beam, which required her to be elevated, and which had given her trouble for 2 days, because the span was wider than she'd originally calculated. She was lying on her stomach across 2 beams, her arm reaching down to guide a support piece into position, her entire weight balanced on her elbows and her knees, when she heard a horse stop below her. She didn't look down immediately. She was at a critical point with the support piece, and she was not going to drop it because some passerby decided to watch. She fitted it into position, tested it with her weight. Satisfied, she sat up slowly, braced herself against the frame, and looked down. A man on a gray horse had pulled up at the edge of her land. He was not an old man, 30, maybe 32, well-dressed by the standards of the territory. Good horse. His hat was pulled low against the morning sun, and he was looking up at her with an expression she couldn't fully read from this distance. Not mocking, not concerned, just looking. She looked back at him. "You need something." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Just passing." "You've stopped?" "Yes, ma'am." Something in his voice shifted just slightly. "I have." She picked up her hammer. "Then enjoy the view. I've got work to do." She went back to work. She heard him sit there for another 2 minutes before he rode on. He came back the next day. This time, he didn't stop at the edge of the property. He rode closer and dismounted, and he stood beside his horse, watching her work on the roof, framing with his hat in his hands. She was up there again. She had come to terms with the height over the past week, and the view from up top had started to feel like something she'd earned, and she heard his footsteps below. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Ethan Carter. My family's ranch borders your property on the north side." She kept working. "I came yesterday," he said, "because my father sent me to talk to you." She stopped, turned to look down at him. "About what?" He didn't flinch at her tone. "He's concerned about your plans for this land. He wanted me to discuss it with you." "Discuss it," she repeated, "or offer to buy me out." A pause. He mentioned that as a possibility. "How much?" He said he'd go to $80. Sarah turned back to her work. "My land cost me $300, and tell your father I said thank you, but no." Another pause longer. Then, "You paid $300 for this land?" "Yes." "Nobody's offered that much for land out here in—" "I didn't say it was worth $300. I said I paid $300 because I needed it to be mine, and I wanted everyone to know I was serious." She drove a nail in. "Now, was there something else?" He didn't answer immediately. She glanced down and found him looking up at her with a different expression than she'd expected. Not the careful blankness of a man being diplomatic. Something more open. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "How long have you been building?" 3 weeks. He looked at what she had built. Looked at it seriously, the way someone looks at a thing they're actually trying to assess. "You do this before?" "No." "You're doing it well," he said. She looked at him. He was not smiling. He was not being charming. He said it the way a man states a fact he has just confirmed with his own eyes. She felt something small, careful, not quite trust shift somewhere in her chest. She said nothing. Turned back to work. He stood below her for another moment. Then he said, "I could hold that beam while you drive the nail, if you want. I'm not here on my father's behalf anymore." She didn't answer right away. She looked at the beam in question. She had been trying to figure out how to brace it while nailing it for the better part of an hour. And the honest answer was that she needed a second pair of hands, and she had been refusing to admit it. "You know," she finally said, "if you help me, that doesn't mean you have any claim on this property. I know that. And it doesn't mean I owe you anything. I know that too." And she said, "If you ever start acting like it does, you'll be off this land before you finish the sentence." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And something, not quite a smile, but close to it, moved across his face. "I understand." She thought about it for another 5 seconds. "All right," she said. "Get up here." He turned out to be genuinely useful. Not because he knew more than her, he didn't, or at least not about construction. But because 2 pairs of hands solved problems that 1 pair couldn't, and because he followed her instructions without modifying them or second-guessing them or slowing down to tell her she was doing something wrong when she wasn't. They worked for 3 hours that first morning. He held beams while she nailed. She directed. He executed. When she paused to figure out the next step, he waited without filling the silence with talk, which was a quality she had not expected and which she found she valued more than she could have predicted. When they stopped for water around midday, he sat on a stump and looked at the framing from a slight distance, and then he said, "Can I ask you something else?" You can ask. Where's your husband? She drank from the canteen, set it down, said gone. He was quiet. Then, gone how? Gone by choice, she said. Mine. He nodded once. Didn't press. She looked at him sideways. Are you going to ask me if I think that was wise? No. Most men do. I reckon most men think it's their business, Ethan said. She studied him. And you don't? He looked out towards the tree line. I think a woman who buys 40 acres in Wyoming and builds a cabin from a book because she wants her child to have a home. She chose. I think that woman has already decided what's wise and what isn't. He looked back at her. I don't see much reason to question it. Sarah held his gaze. She had been talked about, talked over, talked down to, and talked at for most of her adult life. She was not sure she had ever been talked to quite like that. She said nothing because she wasn't sure what to say. And she had learned a long time ago that silence was a better response than filling a moment with words that weren't ready yet. They went back to work. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He never arrived without asking first, or rather, he never arrived without calling out from the edge of the property and waiting for her response. She had not asked him to do this. He had understood on his own that this was a matter of courtesy, and he had extended it without being told. Within 2 weeks, the roof framing was complete. Within 3, she had started on the walls. Ethan worked in the mornings 3 or 4 days a week. In the afternoons, he returned to the Carter Ranch and whatever duties his family required of him, and Sarah worked alone until the light dropped. She did not ask what his father thought about his absence. She already knew what his father thought. The question was what Ethan thought, and the truth was, she was still learning the answer to that. What she did know was that he never looked at her belly and revised his opinion of her capability. He never talked over her. He never arrived with unsolicited advice or a better plan he thought she should consider. When she made a decision about construction, he trusted it. When she was wrong twice, she made errors, she caught herself, he noted it without amplifying it. Just, looks like it needs adjusting there. And waited for her to decide how to adjust it. She was not used to that. She was learning that she had a right to it. Cedar Ridge noticed his visits within the first week. She knew this because Martha Hensley's smile changed the next time Sarah came in for supplies. It had acquired a different quality, sharper, more specific, like a woman who has filed new information in a category she already had strong opinions about. I hear Ethan Carter's been spending time out at your place, Martha said, handing over the flower with a particular kind of careful care. He's helped with construction, Sarah said. He's a neighbor. He's William Carter's son, Martha said. Which is a good deal more than a neighbor. His family owns half this county. I know who his family is. Martha's eyes dropped briefly to Sarah's belly and back up. I just wonder if you've thought about how it looks. A man like that spending time with a woman in your... She stopped herself, rearranged the thought. A woman alone. I haven't thought about how it looks at all, Sarah said. I've been busy building something. She paid for her flower and left before Martha could finish her next thought. Ethan brought it up himself a few days later. They were working on the interior framing. The walls were up and solid, and she had already begun thinking about how the interior would be laid out, where the hearth would go, where her daughter would sleep, and Ethan was holding a beam while she marked it for cutting. He said, "People in town are talking." She marked the beam. "I know. About you. And me. I expected that." He was quiet a moment. "Does it bother you?" She looked up at him. "Do you want the honest answer or the polite one?" "Honest." "I've been talked about since I stepped off the stage," she said. "I've been talked about my entire adult life. People talked about the way I looked, the way I walked, the choices I made, the life I left, the land I bought, and the baby I'm carrying alone." She made the last mark and handed him the beam. "One more category of gossip doesn't change much." He absorbed that. Then, "My father is talking too." She looked at him. "He's not pleased," Ethan said. He said it flatly, like a man reporting weather. "He thinks I'm neglecting the ranch. He thinks..." He stopped. "He thinks you're wasting your time on a foolish woman," Sarah said. Ethan met her eyes. "He thinks I'm being swayed by something that isn't my business." "Is he right?" The question sat between them for a moment. Ethan said, "I don't think helping a neighbor build a cabin is anyone's business but the neighbor's." "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze. Something in his face, the careful, composed expression he usually maintained, went still and then honest. "No," he said. "He's not right." Sarah nodded once, picked up her saw. "Then let's finish this wall." The baby dropped 3 weeks early. Or rather, Sarah woke one morning to the particular pressure and shift that the midwife's manual had described and understood that time had changed shape. The cabin was not finished. The roof was on. The walls were solid. The hearth was built. But the floor was still unfinished on the eastern side, and the windows hadn't been fitted yet, and she had planned for 2 more weeks. She sat up in her bedroll. She had moved inside the cabin walls 3 weeks earlier, once the roof was watertight, and took a long breath and thought about what needed to be done. She pulled on her boots and her coat. She drove to Cedar Ridge. She went not to the doctor's office because Dr. Hayward had made his opinion of her situation plain enough on her first visit. She went to the women's side of town to a woman named Ruby Oakes, who had delivered half the babies in the county and who had, on Sarah's 3rd visit to the general store, pressed a card into her palm and said quietly, "When your time comes, you call on me. Day or night. Don't let Hayward near you if you can help it." Ruby opened the door before Sarah knocked. "Thought you might be coming today," she said. "Get inside." "How did you know?" "Because you've got that look," Ruby said, taking her arm and drawing her in. The look a woman gets when she realizes her body has its own schedule and didn't consult her plans. She sat Sarah down in the kitchen, put a kettle on. "How far apart?" "Not there yet, but close." "Good. We have time." Ruby sat across from her, calm as stone. "Is there anyone you want me to fetch?" Sarah thought about it, just once. She thought about Ethan Carter's face in the morning light, bent over a beam with her level in his hand, moving it with the same care she'd seen him use on everything he touched on her land. Unhurried, precise, present. "No," she said. "Just you." Ruby nodded, poured the tea. 12 hours later in the cabin, she had built with her own hands and her own blood and her own refusal to believe anyone who told her she couldn't. Sarah Whitmore brought her daughter into the world. She named her Clara. She held her in the dark and listened to the pine trees outside, and felt something settle inside her so deep and so permanent that she knew without having to say it to anyone that she had done what she came here to do. She had built the foundation. Everything else was just what came after. Clara was 6 days old the first time Ethan Carter came back. Sarah heard the horse before she saw him. She was sitting near the hearth with Clara against her chest. The baby making the small, urgent sounds that meant she was deciding whether to sleep or to make her displeasure known to the entire territory. Sarah was running on 3 hours of fragmented rest and a determination she was holding together with both hands. She did not get up when she heard the knock at the door frame. The door itself wasn't hung yet. It was on her list 4th or 5th down from the top behind the eastern floor planks and the window frames. "It's Ethan," he said from outside. "I know," she said. "Come in or don't. I'm busy." He came in. He stopped 2 steps inside and looked at her, and she watched him take in the full picture. The exhaustion, the infant, the unfinished floor, the woman who had very clearly not slept a proper night in almost a week, and she watched him not say a single word about any of it. "Ruby told me," he said. "She thought you might want to know the news had got around town." "What news?" "That you delivered alone, that the baby's healthy." He paused. "People are calling it either brave or reckless depending on who you ask." "What are you calling it?" He considered. "Neither. I'm calling it what it is." "And what is that?" "Exactly what you planned," he said. "You built the cabin. You had your daughter in it. That's what you said you were going to do." Clara made a sound, then not crying, just a small declarative noise, like she was confirming her presence in the conversation. Ethan's eyes went to her. Sarah watched something cross his face that she hadn't seen there before. Something quieter and more unguarded than his usual careful expression. "She's small," he said. "All babies are small." "She looks like you." Sarah glanced down at her daughter. "You don't know what I look like well enough to say that." "I know what your face looks like when you've decided something," he said. "She's got it already." Sarah said nothing, but she held Clara a little closer and looked away toward the unfinished floor so he wouldn't see what his words had done to her expression. He stayed for an hour. He didn't hold the baby, didn't ask to which she appreciated, because she was not yet ready to hand Clara to anyone, even for a moment. But he fixed the hinge on the doorframe that had been giving her trouble, and he swept the construction dust that had settled on the finished floorboards, and when he left he said he'd be back Thursday with lumber for the window frames. She didn't say thank you. He didn't wait for it. That was the thing about Ethan Carter that kept unsettling her. He was not trying to earn anything from her. She had spent so many years with a man who catalogued every gesture of generosity like an entry in a ledger, not out of cruelty, but out of the deep assumption that everything given was owed something in return, that the absence of that accounting left her feeling like she was missing a step she'd been braced for. She caught herself waiting for it. Waiting for the moment he'd say something that revealed the real motive, the offer that came with conditions, the kindness that turned out to be a loan. It didn't come, and that in its own way frightened her more than anything she'd encountered since leaving Denver. By the time Clara was 3 weeks old, the cabin was finished. Not perfectly finished. There was a draft in the north corner that she planned to seal before winter, and the floor on the eastern side still needed a second coat of sealant, but finished in the way that mattered. 4 walls, a solid roof, a hearth that drew properly, a door that locked, windows that kept out the wind. She stood outside it one morning, while Clara slept inside, and looked at it the way you look at something you built with your own hands, and your own mistakes, and your own stubborn refusal to accept that it couldn't be done. It was not a large cabin. It was not beautiful by the standards of the homes she'd known in Denver, but it was hers. Fully, completely, legally, actually hers. And she had built it. She had built it while 8 and 9 months pregnant with a construction manual and borrowed tools and no help. She hadn't specifically asked for, and it was standing on 40 acres of land that no one could take from her. She cried a little, standing there alone in the morning air with her arms crossed over her chest. Just a few minutes of it, the kind of crying that comes not from sadness, but from the release of something you've been holding rigid for so long, you forgot you were holding it. Then she went inside and fed Clara and started her list for what needed to be done next. There was always a next. Ethan came on Thursday as promised, with lumber for the window frames and a crate of supplies he said his housekeeper had put together. Sarah looked at the crate. "I didn't ask for supplies," she said. "No," he agreed. "I can provide for myself and for Clara." "I know you can." "Then why?" "Because May has been cooking for 8 people her whole life, and she's down to 2 since my brothers left for Cheyenne," he said. "She made twice what we needed, and she was going to throw half of it out. I told her I knew someone who might rather have it than the compost pile." He set the crate inside the door. "You can throw it out yourself if you'd rather." She looked at the crate. There was a jar of apple preserves on top. Clara was asleep. Sarah had not eaten a real meal in 48 hours because eating a real meal required putting Clara down long enough to cook one. And every time she put Clara down, Clara expressed her opinion about that arrangement loudly and without ambiguity. "Tell May thank you," Sarah said. Ethan nodded. Got to work on the window frames. They worked alongside each other in the easy silence they'd developed over weeks of construction. He fitted the frames. She mixed the sealant for the gaps. Clara slept through most of it, woke for a feeding, and went back to sleep with the particular self-satisfied expression of a baby who has arranged the world exactly as she prefers it. Around midday, Ethan sat back on his heels and looked at the completed window frame and said without turning around, "My father wants to meet with you." Sarah kept mixing. "Does he?" "He's asked twice. I've been putting him off." "Why?" Ethan turned then, and his face had the look it got when he was choosing words with particular care. Because I don't think he wants to meet you so much as he wants to assess you. And I don't think you need to be assessed by my father." Sarah looked up from the sealant. "You don't need to protect me from your father, Ethan." "I know I don't need to." "Then don't. I'm not protecting you," he said. "I'm telling you what I think the meeting would actually be so you can decide whether you want it." She looked at him for a long moment. "What does he want?" "He wants to understand why his son has been spending 3 mornings a week on a neighboring property for the past 2 months." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I was helping a neighbor with construction." Ethan's voice was even. "He said neighbors return the favor and move on. He doesn't understand why I keep coming back." Sarah set down the mixing spoon. "Why do you keep coming back?" The question landed between them with a weight she hadn't entirely intended. He looked at her steadily. "Because I want to," he said. "Because for the first time I can remember I'm doing something that feels like it matters. That feels like it's mine to decide." He paused. "And because your company is better than anyone I've spent time with in a long while." She didn't respond right away. She was very still the way she got when something unexpected had arrived, and she needed a moment to let it settle. Then she said, "Tell your father I'll meet with him." Ethan blinked. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." She picked up the spoon again. "I've been managed and handled and talked around and protected from things my whole life. I'd rather face the thing than wait for it to come find me sideways." He was quiet a moment. "You sure?" "Ethan," she said, "I built this cabin in 11 weeks while 9 months pregnant. A rancher from Cedar Ridge is not going to be the thing that breaks me." Something happened to his expression then. It was not quite a smile, he was too reserved for easy smiling. But his eyes changed in a way she had started to recognize. The way they changed when she said something that landed somewhere real in him. "No," he said. "I reckon he's not." William Carter arrived on a Saturday. He did not come with his hat in his hands. He came with his hat on his head, and 2 ranch hands behind him, and the particular posture of a man who has never needed to make himself smaller to enter a room. He was older than she'd expected, late 60s, with a face that had been lived in hard, and a pair of eyes that assessed everything they landed on, with the frank calculation of a man who had built something large and intended to keep it. He looked at the cabin. He looked at Sarah standing in the doorway with Clara against her shoulder. He looked at the land around them, the neatly stacked extra lumber, the planted garden bed she'd started along the south wall, the cleared path from the cabin to the creek. Then he said, "Mrs. Whitmore." "Mr. Carter," she said. "Come in." He came in alone. He gestured to the ranch hands to stay and looked around the interior the way his son had looked at the framing that first morning. Seriously, like a man assessing a thing he intends to take a position on. "Ethan built some of this," he said. "He helped," Sarah said. "I directed. Everything structural I designed and approved. He provided extra hands when I needed them." William looked at the hearth, looked at the ceiling beams, looked at Clara, who returned his gaze with the severe expression of a 4-week-old deciding whether to cry. "My son has been here more days than not for 2 months." "He has." "Why?" "You'd have to ask him that." William turned to look at her directly. "I'm asking you." Sarah held his gaze. She had met men like William Carter before, not exactly like him, but cut from the same kind of material. Men who had built things and come to believe that everything worth having was in some way connected to what they had built. Men for whom other people's choices were always somewhere underneath about them. "Your son comes here because he decides to," she said. "He is a grown man, Mr. Carter. Where he spends his time is his own business. He's neglecting the ranch. That's between you and him." William's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're not what I expected." "Most people find that," Sarah said. "What did you expect?" He was quiet for a moment. "Something more desperate." "I was desperate," she said. "I spent that energy on the cabin." She shifted Clara to her other shoulder. "What is it you actually came to say, Mr. Carter? Because I don't think it was to compliment the roof beams." He looked at her with something that was not quite respect yet, but was moving in that direction. "I came to offer you an arrangement," he said. "My family's property shares a fence line with your eastern boundary. That land has been nothing but scrub for 10 years. But you're making something of yours, and I can see that." He paused. "I could offer you use of the Carter well, better water rights than your creek in dry season, in exchange for right of passage across your land to the north grazing acreage." Sarah looked at him. "That's a business offer." "It is. Not a buyout." "No." She thought about it. The creek was reliable right now, but she'd read the land records in Cheyenne, and she knew that 3 of the last 7 summers had been dry enough to drop the creek to a trickle. "I'd want it in writing," she said. "Naturally. And I'd want it clear that right of passage means passage, not presence. Your hands cross at agreed times on an agreed route and don't make themselves comfortable on my land." "Agreed." "And the arrangement expires and renegotiates in 5 years." William was quiet for a moment. Then something moved in his face that she thought might be the closest he came to being impressed. "Agreed," he said. They shook hands. Clara observed this transaction with great seriousness from Sarah's shoulder, and then decided it was not as interesting as she'd hoped, and closed her eyes. William Carter put his hat back on and walked to the door. Then he stopped, and he said without turning around, "Ethan tells me you left a wealthy man in Denver." "I did." "Must have been a hard choice." "It wasn't actually," Sarah said. "That's how I knew it was the right one." I was quiet for a moment. Then he walked out. She listened to his horse leave and stood there in her cabin in the quiet that settled after, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief. Just the solid, grounded feeling of a woman who has looked at a hard thing and handled it on her own terms. The trouble started the week Clara turned 6 weeks old. It arrived as most trouble did, in the form of a letter. Sarah recognized the handwriting before she even opened it. The precise, controlled penmanship of a man who had learned to manage everything, including the way words looked on a page. Thomas Caldwell did not write carelessly. He wrote like a man who expected his writing to be kept for the record. She opened it standing at the door. Read it through once, folded it, set it on the table, went and fed Clara, then sat down and read it again. Thomas was coming to Cedar Ridge. He had heard through what channels he did not specify that she had settled in Wyoming with the child. He wished to discuss the matter of the child's welfare, her living situation, and what he described as her concerning choices. He would arrive within the fortnight and hoped she would receive him civilly. He signed it with concern, Thomas. Sarah set the letter down. She was not afraid. She was clear enough about her own feelings to know the difference between fear and the particular cold alertness that arrived when you recognized a threat and started calculating your response. Thomas had no legal claim to her because she had left a marriage she had right to leave. But a child was a different matter. The laws of Wyoming in 1885 were not designed with a woman like Sarah in mind. Fathers had rights. Wealthy fathers had lawyers. Wealthy fathers with sympathetic judges had whatever they chose to pursue. She needed to understand what he could and couldn't do. She drove to Cedar Ridge that afternoon and asked to see Gerald Abbott, the lawyer whose office she'd passed a dozen times without needing him. Abbott was a dry, careful man of about 50 who listened to her without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she was finished, he folded his hands. "Your husband," he began. "Former husband. The divorce was finalized in April. Yes, nevertheless, under Wyoming territorial law, a father has standing to petition for custody if he can demonstrate that the mother's situation is," he paused, "unstable or insufficient. I own 40 acres clear title. I have a completed dwelling. I can document every supply purchased, every structure built." He could argue that a woman living alone on frontier land is insufficient for a child's upbringing. He could argue that the moon is made of cheese, Sarah said. What matters is whether a judge would agree. Abbott considered. "Do you have anyone who could speak to your character, the quality of your home, your fitness as a mother?" She thought about William Carter shaking her hand. She thought about Ruby Oakes, who had delivered Clara and visited every week since. She thought about Ethan. "Yes," she said. "I do." "Then prepare them," Abbott said. Because if Thomas Caldwell is coming here with lawyers, this is not a friendly conversation. She drove back to her land in the long afternoon light, and she sat outside the cabin and held Clara and thought about what she had built and what she had overcome and what was coming now. And she thought, I have been here before. Not on this exact land, not with this exact threat, but in this feeling. This place where everything I've built is at risk, and I have to decide whether to run or stand. She had run once. She had run all the way out here. And she had built something. She was not running again. She told Ethan the next morning. He came on Thursday as usual, and she handed him the letter the moment he walked through the door. He read it standing up, and she watched his expression move through several things. Attention, then recognition, then something tight and deliberate that settled in his jaw. He handed it back. When does he arrive? He says within the fortnight. I think he'll come sooner. Thomas doesn't telegraph. He likes arriving before people have prepared. Ethan was quiet. What do you need? I talked to Abbott yesterday. He said I need people who can speak to my situation, my home, my character, my fitness as a mother. She met Ethan's eyes. I'm going to ask Ruby. I'm going to ask your father about the land agreement we made. That alone shows I'm capable of a legal negotiation. And me, he said. She looked at him. I was going to ask you, but I need you to understand something first. Tell me, if you testify for me or even publicly stand with me, Thomas will use it. He'll say there's something improper between us. He'll say I'm not a fit mother because of whatever story he decides to construct. She held his gaze. And your father will not be pleased. Your family's name will be in it. Ethan looked at her steadily. You're warning me off. I'm telling you the cost, so you can decide with full information. I was quiet for a moment. Long enough that she thought he was going to say he was sorry, but he couldn't risk it. Long enough that she prepared herself for that answer, made peace with it, filed it away. Then he said, Sarah, I have been making decisions based on what my father wants and what the Carter name requires and what is expected of me for my entire adult life. He looked at Clara asleep in the cradle he'd built for her quietly one morning, without being asked 3 weeks ago. I think it's time I made one based on what I know is right. She looked at him. At his face, which was telling her something his voice had kept careful. At the stillness in him that was not detachment, but the opposite, a man very fully present in a moment he had made his choice about. She said, You understand that I'm not asking you to rescue me. I know you're not. I don't need to be rescued. I know that too. A pause. But the truth is the truth. I was there when you built this. I know what you are as a mother, because I watched you plan for that child before she was born. And I'm not going to stay quiet because it might be inconvenient. He looked at her directly. That is not who I want to be. Sarah held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, All right. It was not thank you. It was not an expression of debt. It was in the language they had both been slowly learning to speak with each other, the clearest possible statement of trust. Thomas Caldwell arrived 11 days later. He arrived not in the morning as she'd expected, but at dusk, which was exactly like Thomas, who preferred the light that made other people uncertain. She heard a carriage on the road that wasn't a road yet, just the track she'd worn into the land with her own wagon over 3 months, and she looked out the window and she knew. She set Clara in the cradle. She put on her good boots. She buttoned the top button of her dress. She checked once briefly that the copy of the land deed was in the top drawer of the cabinet she'd built along the north wall. Then she opened the door and stood in it. Thomas stepped down from the carriage. He was exactly as she remembered him, well-dressed, composed with the particular groomed care of a man who never appeared anywhere without having prepared to appear. He had a man beside him she didn't recognize. Young, carrying a leather document case, a lawyer. Thomas looked at the cabin. He looked at the garden. He looked at the land around them, the cleared tracks, the stacked winter wood, the evidence of everything she had done here. And she saw in the brief, unguarded second, before he arranged his face into its usual controlled concern, that he had not expected this. He walked up to her, stopped, said Sarah. Thomas, she said, you've come a long way. I came because I was worried about you." "I know you think that," she said. "Come inside." She stepped back to let him in. He entered, and she watched him take in the cabin interior, the finished floors, the solid walls, the hearth, the cradle in the corner where Clara slept, and she watched the calculation happening behind his eyes as he processed a picture that did not match the one he'd constructed. "You built this," he said. "I did." "Yourself?" "Myself. With some assistance from a neighbor." He turned to look at her. "A neighbor?" "Yes." She sat down across from him. The lawyer stayed near the door. "You said you had concerns about Clara's welfare. Tell me what they are." Thomas sat. He was always better when he had a moment to collect. "You're living out here alone." "Sarah. A woman with an infant on 40 acres of land I own," she said. "Clear title. Registered in Cheyenne. Would you like to see it?" He blinked. "I have a written agreement with the neighboring ranch for water rights," she continued. "I have a completed dwelling sealed against winter. I have provisions laid in through spring. I have a midwife who has visited weekly since Clara was born. I have a lawyer in town who can speak to the legitimacy of every transaction I've made since arriving here." She looked at him steadily. "What exactly is it you think is insufficient?" Thomas was quiet. The calculation had shifted in his face. He had come here expecting to manage a woman in difficulty. He had found a woman who had already managed herself. "I'm her father," he said finally. And there was something underneath the word, something that wanted to sound like feeling, but Sarah had known Thomas long enough to hear what was under it. Not love. Possession. "You are," she said. "And if you want a relationship with your daughter, I will not stand in the way of that. But if what you want is to take her from me, or take this land, or put me back in a situation where someone else is making decisions for my life." She met his eyes without blinking. "You are going to find it a great deal more difficult than you planned." Thomas looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at his lawyer. The lawyer said very quietly, "The land is clearly hers, sir. The dwelling is. I can see what it is," Thomas said. The room was silent for a moment. Clara woke up. She did not cry. She made the small decisive sound she made when she determined that the situation required her attention, and she looked up at the ceiling with her round, steady eyes, and she was exactly what she was, a 6-week-old girl in the home her mother had built. And Thomas Caldwell looked at her, and something crossed his face that Sarah had not seen there in years. Not control, not calculation, something more like loss, like a man who has just understood something he cannot undo. "I'm staying at the hotel in Cedar Ridge," he said. 3 days. "All right," Sarah said. "I'd like to visit with her, if you'll permit it." She looked at him. At the man she had shared a life with, who had never once in 6 years thought to ask what she was building herself into underneath the surface of that life. Who had made every decision for her with complete confidence that he was right and complete blindness to the cost. Who had come here expecting to find wreckage. Who had found a home. "You can visit," she said. "During the day. With me present." He nodded. He stood, and he looked around the cabin one more time, and he said quietly, and she thought she might never know whether he meant it, "You did well, Sarah." She said nothing. He left. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it, and her eyes closed and breathed, just breathed for a long moment. Then Clara made the sound that meant she was hungry, and Sarah pushed off the door and went to her daughter, because that was what came next, and she had never once in her life failed to do what came next. Thomas Caldwell stayed 3 days. He visited twice. Both times he sat in the chair beside the hearth and held Clara with the careful, slightly stiff posture of a man who had not spent much time with infants and was not entirely sure what to do with one. Clara stared up at him with her steady, unreadable eyes and made her judgments silently, as was her custom. Sarah watched from across the room and said very little. On the second visit, Thomas looked up from Clara and said, "She's healthy." "She is." "You're managing well." "I am." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think you would," he said. And it was not cruelty that was the thing about Thomas that had always made him hard to fight. He was never cruel. He simply stated what he believed with the full confidence of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything he'd decided to have an opinion on. "I didn't think this was something you were capable of." "I know you didn't," Sarah said. "I was wrong." She looked at him. In 6 years of marriage, she could count on one hand the number of times Thomas Caldwell had said those 3 words. She had learned not to need them. But hearing them now in this cabin she had built with Clara in his arms, she felt something shift, not forgiveness exactly, and not the reopening of anything closed. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a truth that had taken far too long to arrive. "Yes," she said. "You were." He handed Clara back to her carefully. He put on his hat. He said, "My lawyer has been instructed to file no petitions. I won't contest your custody." She looked at him steadily. "What changed your mind?" Thomas glanced around the cabin one more time. At the walls she had built. At the floor she had sealed. At the winter wood stacked outside the window. At the woman sitting across from him, who was none of the things he had decided she was. "You did," he said. And then he walked out. She heard his carriage leave. She sat in the silence with Clara against her shoulder, and she breathed slow and even, and she let herself believe carefully, provisionally, the way you believe in good news when you have learned not to trust it too quickly, that it was over. It was not over. She found out 10 days later. Ruby Oakes came to the cabin on a Tuesday morning with her jaw set and her eyes carrying the particular expression of a woman who has information she does not want to deliver. She came inside, accepted tea, and waited until Clara was asleep before she said anything. "There's talk in town," she said. "There's always talk in town," Sarah said. "This is different talk." Ruby wrapped both hands around her mug. "Thomas Caldwell didn't leave Cedar Ridge when his carriage left your property. He went to the hotel, and he stayed. And he's been meeting with Judge Harlan Morse." Sarah set down her cup. "Morse," she said. "He was appointed 3 years ago. William Carter supported his appointment." Ruby met her eyes. "And he and Thomas Caldwell were at the same table at the hotel dining room for 2 hours on Friday night." The silence between them had weight. Sarah said, "Thomas told me he wasn't filing any petitions." His lawyer filed one yesterday morning," Ruby said. "Gerald Abbott got word to me because he knew I'd come straight to you. The petition claims that you are living in an environment unsuitable for an infant. It names the isolation, the physical condition of the property, and—" She paused. "It names Ethan Carter." Sarah was very still. "It names him how? It claims an inappropriate relationship. That a married woman, Thomas, is contesting the divorce now, Sarah. He's filed a separate motion in Denver claiming the grounds were insufficient." She stood up. She didn't say anything. She walked to the window, stood with her back to the room, and processed what Ruby had just told her with the focused speed of a woman who had learned that panic was a luxury she could not afford. Thomas had not changed his mind. He had sat in her chair and held her daughter and said, "I was wrong, and he had been lying." Or not. Thomas never lied exactly, but managing. Buying time. Giving her enough relief to lower her guard while his lawyer walked into the courthouse. She turned around. "When's the hearing?" 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She crossed to the cabinet and pulled out the land deed, the water agreement, every document she had filed since arriving in Wyoming. "I need to see Abbott today." "Sarah, I need to see Abbott, and I need to talk to Ethan, and I need to understand exactly what Morse can and cannot do under territorial law." She looked up. "Will you watch Clara for 3 hours?" Ruby set down her mug and stood up. "I'll watch her all day if you need it. But Sarah, sit down for just 1 minute." "I don't have 1 minute." "Sit down." She sat. Ruby looked at her directly. "What Thomas is doing is not legal maneuvering. It's not about Clara. It's about what you represent to him." She paused. "You left. You built something. You proved him wrong in the most public way a woman in your position can prove a man wrong. He cannot live with that." Sarah looked at her hands. At the calluses on her palms that had been soft when she left Denver. At the roughened skin across her knuckles. At the evidence written into her own body of what she had built. "I know," she said quietly. Then you know that winning the legal case isn't going to be enough, Ruby said. Because even if you win, he'll find another angle, another motion, another judge he can get to. She paused. The only way this stops is if you make it cost him more than it costs you. Sarah lifted her eyes. How? Ruby smiled. It was not a gentle smile. By making sure the whole of Cedar Ridge and beyond it knows exactly who Thomas Caldwell is and exactly who you are. Courts run on law, but judges run on public opinion, whether they admit it or not. She stood up. Now go see Abbott. I'll be here with Clara. Abbott's face when she walked into his office told her everything Ruby hadn't. Sit down, Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Tell me the worst of it first, she said. I find that easier. He folded his hands. The divorce challenge is serious. Thomas has engaged a firm in Denver with considerable resources, and they're arguing procedural grounds, specifically that the serving of papers was improper, which would void the filing. He paused. If the divorce is invalidated, you are legally still his wife, which changes the custody question entirely. Sarah said, Can they make that argument stick? They can make it. Whether it sticks depends on the judge. He met her eyes. In a different county with a different judge, I'd say the procedural challenge is thin. With Harlan Morse, I want to be honest with you. I don't know. What do I need? Evidence of your fitness as a mother and a property owner, which you have in abundance. Character witnesses, which I believe you can provide. He hesitated. And something that demonstrates Thomas Caldwell's motivations are not what he's claiming them to be. He told me he wasn't filing any petitions, she said, 2 hours after telling me that his lawyer walked into the courthouse. Abbott looked up sharply. Did anyone hear him say that? She thought. Clara, she said, who is 6 weeks old and unlikely to be credible. He almost smiled. Anyone else? She thought harder. Ruby Oakes was outside. She may have heard the carriage leave. She'd know the timing. She paused. And Ethan Carter. He came by that evening. I told him what Thomas had said. Abbott wrote something down. About Ethan Carter, the petition mentions him. I know, in ways that are inflammatory. The implication is that your relationship with him is improper, and that his presence on your property constitutes an unsuitable environment for a child. There is nothing improper between Ethan Carter and myself. I know that. But impropriety doesn't need to exist to be alleged. He set down his pen. If Ethan testifies on your behalf, it will be used against you. If he doesn't testify, you lose a witness who was present for the construction of this entire homestead and can speak to your capability as a builder and a mother more credibly than almost anyone. He looked at her. It's your decision, but you need to make it knowing that. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she said, Set up the testimony. Ethan decides for himself. She went to the Carter Ranch for the first time. She had never been. Their arrangement had always been that Ethan came to her, which was how she preferred it, and how he had respected without comment. Driving up to the main house now with Clara bundled against the autumn chill and her documents in the bag beside her, she understood for the first time the full scale of what the Carter name meant in this county. The house was not a house the way her cabin was a house. It was 3 stories white painted with a porch that ran the full length of the front, and 2 barns visible behind it, and fencing that stretched in every direction as far as she could see. She pulled up and was met by a young ranch hand who took her horse with the quick efficiency of someone who did this 20 times a day. Ethan came out of the house before she reached the steps. He looked at her face. He said, Come inside. She told him in the front room, while Clara slept in the crook of her arm, with the door open, because she would not be in a closed room in another man's house, not even this one. She told him everything: Abbott's assessment, the divorce challenge, the petition, the motion. And then she told him what Abbott had said about his testimony. When she was finished, Ethan was quiet for long enough that she heard the fire in the next room shift. Then he said, He lied to you. He managed me, she said. There's a difference with Thomas. He doesn't think of it as lying. What does he think of it as? Handling a situation, she said. He's been handling situations his whole life. He handles them so smoothly that sometimes you don't realize you've been handled until you're already somewhere else. Ethan looked at her. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to understand the cost before you decide," she said. "If you testify for me, it gets used against me. If you don't, I lose a witness who knows more about what I built here than anyone." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to testify. I'm asking you to choose." "I'm going to testify," he said, simply, like it had already been decided for some time, and the formality of being asked was just catching up to the fact. "Your father." "My father and I are going to have a conversation," Ethan said. "That is long overdue." He stood up. "He's home. I'd like to have it now if you're willing to wait." She looked at him. "Ethan, you don't have to do this in front of me. I'm not doing it in front of you. I'm doing it because it needs to be done, and because you came here today, and because—" He stopped. He looked at Clara, then at Sarah. Then he said more quietly, "Because I am done making decisions based on what this family's name requires, instead of what I believe is right." She said nothing. She sat with Clara, and she waited. She heard them through the wall. Not every word. She was not trying to listen, but enough. William Carter's voice low and controlled, and then not controlled. Ethan's voice steadier than she expected, quieter than she expected, with a certainty in it she had not heard before. She heard William say, "You understand what this looks like." She heard Ethan say, "I understand what it is. What it looks like is something else entirely." She heard William say, "That woman is going to cost you everything I've built." She heard Ethan say, "What you've built, sir, not what I've built. And I'm beginning to think those aren't the same thing." A long silence. Then William quieter. "She's got nothing, a cabin and 40 acres. And Ethan also quiet. She built that cabin herself with a child due in 11 weeks from a book. What I've got is a name I inherited and land I didn't earn. I know which one I respect more." She stopped listening then, because what came next was not hers to hear. She looked down at Clara, and she thought about what it cost a man to say a thing like that to his father. What it required him to give up, not just in the argument, but in everything that came after. She thought about the particular weight of family expectation, which she knew something about, though hers had looked different. The way it sat on you. The way you could carry it for years without recognizing it as a weight, because you'd never known what it felt like without it. Ethan came back into the room 20 minutes later. His face was composed, but there was something different in it, something that had been carefully held in a certain shape for a very long time, and had now settled into a different one. Like a man who has put something down after carrying it so long, he'd forgotten he was carrying it. "He won't interfere," Ethan said. "He won't support the testimony, but he won't work against it." "That cost you," Sarah said quietly. "Yes," he said. He sat down. "It did." She looked at him. "I'm sorry." He looked back at her with a directness that was at this point one of the most familiar things she knew about him. "Don't be. I should have done it years ago." He paused. "I'm going to testify. And I'm going to tell the truth about what I saw. That's all I can do." "It's enough," she said. He nodded once. "Tell Abbott." The 3 weeks before the hearing were the hardest of any Sarah had spent in Cedar Ridge, harder even than the first weeks of construction, because then she had been working against nature and indifference, which were honest opponents. Now she was working against something that wore the shape of law, but had malice underneath it, and that required a different kind of endurance. Thomas remained in Cedar Ridge. He did not visit the cabin again. But she felt his presence in town the way you feel weather before it arrives, in the way people's eyes shifted when she came in for supplies, in the way Martha Hensley's smile had acquired a new quality of careful distance, in the way the station master's wife moved slightly when Sarah passed her on the boardwalk. Thomas was talking to people. She didn't know exactly what he was saying, but she knew the effect the slow, polite withdrawal of a town that had never been fully warm, but had at least been neutral, and was now sorting itself into camps. Ruby Oaks told her to ignore it. "He's spending money and time on people who weren't going to testify for you anyway," Ruby said. "Focus on who you have." What she had was Ruby, who had attended the birth and visited weekly and kept detailed notes, because Ruby kept detailed notes about everything. She had Gerald Abbott, who had built a careful document-by-document account of every legal transaction Sarah had made since arriving in Wyoming. She had the land deed, the water agreement, the receipts from the lumber yard, and the building manual with her own handwritten notes in every margin. And she had Ethan, who arrived the morning before the hearing with his good suit on and his hat in his hands, and said simply, "Tell me what Abbott wants me to say." "Tell the truth," Sarah said. "That's what I planned." He looked at her. She'd been up since before dawn, and she looked it. "You sleep at all?" "Some." "Clara." "Slept fine. She's not the one with a hearing in the morning." He sat down across from her. "I want to tell you something before tomorrow." She looked at him. "Whatever happens in that courthouse," he said, "this land is yours, that cabin is yours, Clara is yours. I don't care what Morse decides, or what Thomas Caldwell pays for, or what any judge in Wyoming territory has to say about it. You built something real. That doesn't unbuild itself because a man in a black robe signs a paper." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're talking like we might lose." "I'm talking like the truth matters regardless of the outcome." "The truth matters most when we win," she said. "So let's make sure we win." He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." The courthouse in Cedar Ridge was a single room that smelled of pine and old paper, with 2 rows of benches and a raised platform at the front where Judge Harlan Morse sat with the practiced stillness of a man who had learned to look impartial. Sarah walked in with Abbott on one side and Clara in her arms, and she heard the room shift when she entered the small collective intake of attention. The heads turning the particular quality of silence that means a lot of people have been talking about you and have stopped the moment you appeared. Thomas was already seated at the opposite table. He looked exactly as he always looked, pressed, composed, prepared. His lawyer was beside him with the leather case and an expression of professional neutrality. Thomas did not look at her. She sat down, settled Clara in the crook of her arm, arranged her documents on the table, and waited. Morse opened the proceedings with the careful language of a man who intended to appear thorough. He outlined the petitions, the custody question, the divorce challenge, the suitability claim. He spoke for 12 minutes, and Sarah listened to every word, and she understood by the end of those 12 minutes that the man was predisposed. Not overtly, not in any way that could be named, but in the small choices of language, the petitioner's concerns, used for Thomas's claims, versus the respondent's situation, used for hers. She heard it. The slight, careful tilt of a man who had already decided and was now constructing the appearance of process. Ruby went first. She stood at the front of the room in her best dress, with her notebook of observations, and she answered Abbott's questions with the precise, unflinching clarity of a woman who delivered babies for a living and was not impressed by courtrooms or judges. "I attended the birth on September 14th, she said. "The cabin was finished watertight and warm. The mother was exhausted but fully capable. She was calm. She was prepared. She had a supply of provisions laid in for the winter, a clean water source, and a plan for every contingency I could identify." She paused. "I have attended 112 births in this county. Sarah Whitmore is among the most prepared mothers I have encountered." Thomas's lawyer had 3 questions. "Isn't it true that the birth was unattended by a physician?" "It was attended by me," Ruby said. "I am a certified midwife with 23 years of practice. Physician attendance was not available for the majority of the births in this county." "Isn't it true the cabin was not complete at the time of the birth?" "The cabin was weather-tight, heated, and structurally complete. The flooring in one corner was not yet finished. It was finished 6 days later. In your opinion, is a single woman living alone on frontier land an appropriate environment for an infant?" Ruby looked at the lawyer with the expression of a woman who has heard a very stupid question asked by someone who should know better. "In my opinion," she said, "an infant requires warmth, shelter, nourishment, and a mother who is present and capable. Mrs. Whitmore provides all 4. The number of parents present is considerably less relevant than the quality of the one who is." Thomas's lawyer sat down. Abbott called the land records. He walked Morse through every document, the deed, the Cheyenne filing, the water agreement with the Carter Ranch, the lumber receipts. He built the picture slowly and carefully, the way you build a wall, one layer at a time, until the thing was undeniable. Thomas's lawyer objected twice. Morse sustained one objection, overruled the other. Sarah watched the judge's face, and she kept her own face still. Then Thomas's lawyer stood up and called Thomas. And Thomas told his story. He told it the way he told everything: controlled, reasonable, measured. He spoke of concern. He spoke of duty. He spoke of a father's right to know his child was safe. He spoke of isolation and hardship and the challenges of frontier life for an infant. He never raised his voice. He never said an unkind word about Sarah directly. But underneath it, in the careful architecture of his concern, in the way he spoke of her choices, as though they were symptoms of something she heard, the same thing she had always heard from Thomas. She is not capable of deciding for herself. She needs to be managed. This is for her own good. Abbott cross-examined him for 20 minutes. He was methodical. He established the time, the announcement that Sarah would be sent to St. Louis the morning she left, the months between her departure and his arrival in Cedar Ridge. He established that Thomas had told Sarah he was not filing any petitions. He established the precise timing of when the petition was actually filed. "You told Mrs. Whitmore you had instructed your lawyer to file no petitions," Abbott said. "Correct. I told her I was not pursuing custody," Thomas said carefully. "That is not what she testified. We may have understood each other differently. The petition was filed the morning after your second visit to her property. Is that correct?" A pause. "That is correct. So within 12 hours of telling her you were not pursuing custody, your lawyer filed a custody petition." "I changed my mind." "Overnight?" "Yes." After seeing the cabin, Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. After reflecting further, Abbott looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "No further questions." Ethan was the last witness. He walked to the front of the room, and Sarah watched the room watch him. The Carter name doing what it always did in Cedar Ridge, which was draw attention and confer weight. He was dressed simply. He sat straight. He looked at Abbott when Abbott spoke, and at Morse when Morse spoke, and at no one else. Abbott said, "You assisted Mrs. Whitmore in the construction of her cabin, is that correct?" "I did." "For how long?" "Approximately 8 weeks, 3 to 4 mornings per week." "In your assessment, who designed and directed the construction?" "Mrs. Whitmore," Ethan said. "I followed her plans and her instructions throughout. Every structural decision was hers." "What was her condition during that time?" "She was 8 and 9 months pregnant." "Did you observe anything that concerned you about her ability to care for herself or her child?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Not because he was uncertain Sarah knew. Because he was choosing his words with the exactness they deserved. "No," he said. "I observed a woman who was more organized, more capable, and more clear-headed under difficult conditions than most people I have known in my life. I observed her solve problems that experienced builders would find challenging. I observed her plan for her daughter's arrival with the same thoroughness she brought to every other aspect of the construction." He paused. "I was not concerned about her. I am genuinely admiring of her." Thomas's lawyer stood up. "Mr. Carter," he said, "how often do you currently visit Mrs. Whitmore's property?" Ethan looked at him calmly. "Several times a week." "And what is the nature of your relationship with Mrs. Whitmore?" "We are neighbors and friends." "Nothing more?" A pause. The room held its breath. "Nothing improper," Ethan said. "If that is what you are implying." "I'm asking what the nature of the relationship is." "And I've answered," Ethan said. "We are neighbors and friends. I respect her. I believe she has built something remarkable. I intend to continue being her neighbor and her friend for as long as she'll have that from me." His voice was even. "Whether that is a subject for legal proceedings is a question I'll leave to the judge." Thomas's lawyer sat down. Morse looked at his papers. Sarah looked at Morse. And in the silence before the judge spoke, in that compressed held moment, where everything she had built and everything she had survived sat on a scale she could not control, she felt something move through her that was not fear, not hope exactly. Certainty. Not certainty about the outcome. She had no certainty about Morse, and she knew it. Certainty about herself, about the fact that she had done what she came here to do. She had stood in a room full of people who had every structural advantage over her, and she had told the truth. Document by document, witness by witness, without apology and without performance. Whatever Morse decided, that was already done. Morse set down his papers. He said, "I'm going to recess until tomorrow morning. I'll have a decision at 9 o'clock." Abbott's hand came to the table beside hers, not touching just present. She gathered her documents. She picked up Clara, who had been remarkable through the entire proceeding and who was now beginning to express strong reservations about the length of the afternoon. She walked out of this courthouse with her back straight and her daughter on her shoulder, and she did not look at Thomas, and she did not look at Morse, and she did not let anyone see the thing in her chest that was working very hard to hold itself together until she was somewhere private enough to let it go. Ethan caught up with her outside. He walked beside her without speaking for half a block. Then he said quietly, "You were extraordinary in there." She kept walking. "We don't have a decision yet." "I know." A pause. "But I wanted to say it now, while it's true and before tomorrow makes it complicated to say it cleanly." She stopped walking. She stood on the boardwalk in Cedar Ridge with her daughter against her shoulder and the late afternoon light doing what it did this time of year in Wyoming, which was turn everything, the color of something you wanted to hold on to. And she looked at Ethan Carter, who had stood up in a courthouse and told the truth at a cost she still didn't fully know. And she felt something in her chest that she had been holding at a careful distance for weeks because she had not been ready for it, and she was not entirely sure she was ready for it now. But it was there. It had been there for a while. "Thank you," she said. And she meant all of it, not just the testimony, not just today, but the beams and the mornings and the cradle he'd built without being asked, and the conversation with his father she'd heard through the wall, and every Thursday and every moment he had shown up and been exactly what he said he was. He looked at her. Something in his face was quiet in the way it got when he was not performing anything, not composure, not reserve, just the actual man underneath it. "Get some rest," he said. 9 o'clock is going to come early." She nodded. She walked to her wagon. She drove home. And the night before, Harlan Morse delivered his decision. Sarah Whitmore sat in the cabin she had built with her own hands, and she held her daughter, and she looked at the walls she had raised, and the floor she had sealed, and the hearth she had mortared stone by stone. And she talked to Clara the way she had talked to her since before she was born, quietly, honestly, without pretending the world was simpler than it was. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "I need you to know something. This home is yours. I built it for you. And nobody, not your father, not a judge, not a town full of people who expected us to fail, nobody gets to take from us what we built ourselves." Clara looked up at her with those steady, unreadable eyes. And then she reached up, and her small hand closed around Sarah's finger, and she held on. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Harlan Morse walked into the courthouse and sat down and said nothing for 45 seconds. Sarah counted them. She was seated at Abbott's table with Clara in her arms and her documents stacked in front of her and her hands completely still in her lap. She had learned somewhere in the last 3 months that stillness was a form of strength, not passivity, not waiting, but the deliberate choice to conserve everything until the moment it was needed. Ethan was in the second row behind her. She could not see him, but she felt him there, the way you feel something solid behind you in the dark. Thomas sat at his table with his lawyer and his leather case and his composed, patient face. Morse set down his papers. He said, "I've reviewed the documents submitted by both parties. I've heard the testimony. I'm prepared to deliver my finding." He paused. Sarah did not look at Thomas. She looked at Morse, and she held Clara, and she breathed. On the matter of the divorce challenge, Morse said, "The court finds the procedural objection insufficient. The serving of papers in the Caldwell divorce was conducted according to the laws of the territory of Colorado, and this court has no jurisdiction to overturn those findings. The divorce stands." Thomas's lawyer wrote something. Thomas did not move. "On the matter of this custody petition," Morse continued, and here his voice shifted not dramatically, just slightly. A man picking his way through something he has decided carefully. "The court finds that Mrs. Sarah Whitmore has demonstrated clear and substantial fitness as a mother and as a provider." The property at 40 acres north of Cedar Ridge is legally registered structurally sound and maintained to a standard appropriate for the raising of a child. He looked up from his papers. The petition is denied. The room released. Not loudly, it was a courthouse, and the people in it were constrained by the location. But she heard it. The small collective exhale. Ruby's hand finding her shoulder from the row behind. Abbott's pen going still. Sarah looked down at Clara. Clara looked back at her with those eyes. "Ma'am," Morse said, and she looked up. He was looking directly at her, and his expression had something in it she had not expected. Not warmth exactly, but something like acknowledgement. One person recognizing another. "The court finds no basis for any further proceedings in this matter." He stood. The room stood. Thomas's lawyer was already gathering papers. Thomas himself sat for a moment longer than everyone else, which was the first uncontrolled thing she had seen from him since he arrived in Cedar Ridge. Just a moment, 2 seconds, maybe three, where he sat in his chair while everyone around him moved and he was very still and she could not see his face. Then he stood. He straightened his coat. He picked up his hat. He did not look at her as he walked out. She watched him go. And she felt not triumph. Not the sharp high heat of winning she might have expected. Something quieter and more permanent. The feeling of a door closing that had been ajar too long, letting in a draft she'd learned to live with, and the sudden startling warmth of a room that was finally sealed. Ruby's arms came around her from behind Clara and all, and Ruby said into her ear, "There it is." Sarah said, "There it is." Abbott found her outside going over the formal copies of the ruling. "He'll appeal," Abbott said. "Not unkindly, just carefully. Can he win an appeal? Not on these facts, not without something new." He paused. "He could try to manufacture something new." "Then we'll handle it when it comes," Sarah said. "If it comes." Abbott looked at her with the expression of a man who had seen a great many legal battles and could recognize when someone had the stomach for a long one. "Yes," he said. "I think you will." He handed her the papers. She tucked them into her bag beside Clara. Ethan was waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps. He had his hat in his hands, and he was watching her come down with an expression that was quieter than she expected, not celebratory, but something deeper. The kind of look that is not about the outcome, but about everything that led to it. "It's done," she said when she reached him. "I know." A pause. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I need to go home," she said, "and split some wood, and feed my daughter, and not think about Thomas Caldwell for about a week." Something in his face eased. "That sounds about right." "You should go see your father," she said. He looked at her. "I mean it," she said. "What you did in that courtroom, what you said to him at the ranch that cost you something real. Go tend to it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He's not an easy man to tend to." "I know. Go anyway." She shifted Clara to her other arm. "Come by Thursday if you want. There's still sealant work on the north corner." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was doing what it did this time of year, sharp and clean and honest, and in it, she could see his face completely, the tiredness, the relief, the thing underneath both that he had not said, and that she had not asked him to say. "Thursday," he said. She nodded, walked to her wagon. She drove home with the ruling in her bag, and her daughter asleep against her chest, and the road opening up ahead of her straight north, 6 miles to land that was hers. She split wood for 2 hours when she got home. Not because she needed to, she had enough split wood to last the month, but because her body needed something to do with the feeling inside her. And splitting wood had been the thing that worked since the beginning. The clean physical reality of it. The way the grain gave under the axe if you read it right. The evidence immediate and undeniable of work completed. When she was done, she sat on the step and looked at the stack and felt the quiet settle around her. Thomas would appeal. Maybe. Abbott thought perhaps probably not. Either way, she would handle it. She had handled everything else, and she had done it without losing the thing that mattered herself, her daughter, this ground under her feet. Clara woke up inside and announced it with the particular urgency she reserved for hunger, and Sarah went in and fed her and sat in the chair by the hearth and let the afternoon move around her at its own pace for the first time in weeks. She had not realized until this moment how much of herself she had been holding clenched for the past month. How much energy had gone into preparation and readiness, and the constant low-level vigilance of knowing a threat was circling. It had been like bracing against a wind so long that when it stopped, you forgot for a moment how to stand without leaning. She let herself lean into the back of the chair. Clara fell asleep again. The fire did what fires do, and Sarah Whitmore sat in the cabin she had built and breathed for the first time in a very long time, without anything pressing up behind the breath. Ethan came Thursday as he'd said. He looked better than he had outside the courthouse. Not lighter exactly. Whatever had happened between him and William Carter in the intervening days had clearly not been simple, but clearer. Like a man who has walked through something difficult and come out the other side knowing more about himself than he did before. He worked on the north corner sealant without comment. Sarah worked on the kitchen shelf she'd been framing since before the hearing. Clara slept in the cradle he'd built, which was positioned now in the main room where she could see it from wherever she was working. Around midday, Ethan said, "I talked to my father." "How did that go?" "He's not pleased." A pause. "But he's not disowning me either, which I wasn't entirely sure of." "He mixed the sealant. He said you were a difficult woman." Sarah looked up. "What did you say?" "I said that was probably the most accurate thing he'd ever said about you." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "He didn't find that as funny as I did." She looked at him. "What else did he say?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He said that a man who throws away his family's future for a woman on 40 acres is a fool. And I told him the 40 acres was 52 now, since the creek access on the south boundary I registered last week." He looked at her sideways. "And that I didn't think I was throwing anything away. I thought I was starting something." She set down her hammer. "Starting what?" He looked at her directly. Ethan Carter, who said things simply and exactly when he chose to say them, who had never once given her cause to doubt what he meant. "Something I get to choose," he said. "For the first time." The room was very quiet. Clara made a small sound in her sleep. Outside, a magpie made the only kind of commentary magpies make, sharp and without concern for whether it was wanted. Sarah looked at Ethan for a long time. She was a woman who had learned to read what was underneath language, who had spent years in a marriage where what was said and what was meant were rarely the same thing. She was looking now, and she could find no gap between them. No management. No agenda underneath the surface. Just a man who had decided something and was telling her what it was. "I'm not an easy woman," she said. "Your father was right about that." "I know. I make my own decisions. I always will." "I know that too. And I'm not looking for someone to take care of me." "Sarah." He said it quietly. "I know. That is not what I'm offering." "What are you offering?" He was quiet for a moment. The careful kind of quiet that meant he was saying the true thing instead of the convenient one. "Company," he said, "and honesty. And someone who thinks what you've built here is one of the finest things he's ever seen, and who would like, if you'll have it, to keep being nearby while you build whatever comes next." She looked at him. She thought about the girl she had been in Denver, managed, arranged, decided for, so gradually and so completely, that she had almost forgotten there was a self underneath the arrangement worth deciding things on behalf of. She thought about the woman who had driven out of that city at dawn with $156 and a building manual and a baby growing inside her and 40 acres of nothing waiting at the end of a very long road. She thought about what it had taken, what she had done, what she was, and she thought about this man who had come to her land on his father's errand and stayed because he chose to, who had carried beams and built a cradle and stood up in a courthouse and said the truth out loud in a room full of people for whom the truth was inconvenient. "Thursday," she said. He looked at her. "You can keep coming on Thursdays," she said. "And other days, if there's work that needs doing, and we'll see." Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They went back to work. 2 weeks later, Martha Hensley stopped her on the boardwalk. Sarah had Clara in the sling across her chest and flour on her list, and not much patience for what she could already see in Martha's expression, the particular mixture of curiosity and something that wanted to look like concern. "I heard the hearing went well," Martha said. "It did. And that Ethan Carter testified for you." "He did." Martha tilted her head. "He's been spending a good deal of time at your property." "He has. People are saying." Martha stopped, rearranged herself. "I just wonder if you've thought about how this looks, Sarah. A man of his standing. A woman in your—" "Martha," Sarah said, not unkindly, but clearly, "I have thought about almost nothing that other people think about me since I arrived in this town. I have thought about timber and floor joists and water rights and legal documents and my daughter's feeding schedule." She shifted Clara in the sling. "I have not had space in that list for how things look to people who did not help me build any of it." Martha blinked. "Good morning," Sarah said. She went into the general store and got her flour. Ta-tang. The letter from Thomas came a month after the hearing. She recognized the handwriting, and she held it for a moment before opening it, bracing for what was inside. Then she opened it. It was short, 3 paragraphs. He was not appealing. His lawyer had advised him that the grounds for appeal were insufficient, and that further proceedings would be unlikely to succeed. He had accepted this advice. He asked that she send word through Abbott's office if he was to be permitted any further contact with Clara. He said he would not impose himself on her property again without invitation. And in the last paragraph, which was the one she read 3 times, he said, "I have spent considerable time since Cedar Ridge thinking about the way things were between us. I don't know that I understand it fully, even now. But I know that what you have built in Wyoming is something I would not have believed possible when you left Denver. I was wrong about what you were capable of. I was wrong about a great many things. I do not expect you to find comfort in this, and I am not asking for it. I am simply saying it because it is true, and because I have found late, and perhaps too late, that saying true things matters more than I once believed. With respect, Thomas." She folded the letter, set it in the drawer with the land deed and the water agreement and the ruling from Harlan Morse's court. She sat for a while. She did not cry. She had cried about Thomas a long time ago in the privacy of early mornings, in a marriage that felt like a house with all the windows painted shut, and she had spent those tears honestly, and she did not have more of them for him now. What she felt was something else. Not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness was a thing she might arrive at eventually in her own time without being asked for it. But a kind of settling. A final accounting. She had not needed Thomas to admit he was wrong for her life to be right. She had built that life regardless. But there was something in seeing it named in the careful, formal handwriting of a man who had never once said "I was wrong" in 6 years of marriage that closed something quietly. She picked up Clara. "Your father is not a bad man," she told her daughter. "He's just a man who never learned to let other people be real." She kissed the top of Clara's head. "We're going to make sure you don't have that problem." Clara grabbed a fistful of her mother's collar and held on. Ethan came the next morning. He did not come on a Thursday. This was a Wednesday, and he came earlier than usual, which told her something had happened. She saw his horse from the window and went to the door, and she could read it in the set of his shoulders before he dismounted. "What is it?" she said. He came up to the door. "My father had a fall this morning. He's all right. It's his ankle, not his head, but he's going to be off his feet for 6 weeks. He paused. "I'm needed at the ranch full-time for a while." She looked at him. "Then go." "I know." Something in his face was working through a calculation. I'm not disappearing, Sarah. I want you to know that." "I know you're not." Ethan!" She put her hand on his arm briefly the first time she had touched him deliberately, outside of necessity, and she felt him go very still at the contact. "Go take care of your family. I've been taking care of mine since September without assistance. 6 weeks is not going to undo anything." He looked down at her hand, then at her face. "No," he said quietly. "It won't." She let her hand drop. "Tell your father I hope his ankle heals clean." "I will." He paused. He's going to need me to step up at the ranch, more than I have been. Then step up. That might mean less time here, for a while. She looked at him steadily. I know. I don't want you to think. I don't think anything, she said. You have a family and a ranch and responsibilities. I have a homestead and a daughter and my own responsibilities. Those two things are not in competition. She held his gaze. Go, Ethan. He nodded. He was still for a moment looking at her with the full particular honesty of his gaze, and she looked back at him and did not look away. Then he put on his hat. He said, I'll come when I can. I'll be here, she said. He rode away. She stood in the door and watched him go, and then she went inside, and she picked up her daughter, and she got on with the day, because there was always a day, and she had always known how to get on with it. 6 weeks became 8. William Carter's ankle healed slower than expected, and then there was an issue with the north pasture fencing, and then 2 of the ranch hands quit in the same week, and the cattle needed moving to winter grazing before the first hard snow. Ethan sent word through Joel, the same wagon driver who had brought her to her land on the first day, with brief notes that were not long but were regular every week, sometimes twice, and that said what they needed to say without ornamentation. Winter pasture is in. Father walking without the cane now. North fence finished. May asks about Clara. She wrote back also brief, also regular. Clara has 2 teeth. Garden put to bed for winter. South wall held fine in the last wind. Tell May she's welcome to come visit. She did not need him to be there. But she noticed the particular quality of Tuesday evenings, which was the day she'd started to think of as the day before he might come, and how that day had a slight charge to it that Saturdays and Sundays and Mondays didn't have. She noticed it, and she acknowledged it, and she didn't pretend it wasn't there, because she had learned to be honest with herself about what she felt, even when what she felt was inconvenient. She was not lonely. Her life was full. Clara, the animals she'd acquired in the fall, the garden planning she was doing for spring, the ongoing correspondence with Abbott about the final formalities of the divorce, Ruby's weekly visits. She was not waiting for Ethan, she was living, but she was also aware of the shape of him in her days. The way he fit into the life she was building here, not by taking up space she hadn't offered, but by fitting into space that had it turned out already been shaped for something like him. He came back on a Thursday, because of course it was a Thursday. 8 weeks and 4 days after his father's fall, on a morning in late November, when the first real cold had settled over the Wyoming plain, and the sky had the dense low look of approaching snow. She heard a horse on her road, and she knew the sound of it. She did not go to the door immediately. She finished what she was doing. She was mending a harness at the table, something that required both hands and attention, and she set it down neatly, and she stood up, and then she went to the door. He was tying his horse at the post she'd put up along the front of the cabin in October. He was wearing his heavy coat, and he had his hat pulled against the wind, and he was thinner than she remembered, which told her something about the last 8 weeks that his notes had not. He looked up when she opened the door. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The wind moved between them, and Clara made a sound from somewhere inside the cabin, and a single flake of snow fell from the low sky and landed on the step between them and dissolved. Then Ethan said, "I'm back." "I see that," Sarah said. "My father's on his feet. The ranch is managed." He paused. "I'm my own man again." She looked at him. "Were you not your own man before?" "I was working on it," he said. "I'm further along than I was." She stepped back from the door. Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." He came in. He hung his hat on the hook. The hook she had put there in September, one of a row of them by the door, and she had not examined too closely whose she thought they were for, and he sat down at the table, and Clara saw him from her spot on the floor, and produced the sound she reserved for people whose faces she recognized and approved of, which was a sound that started low and rose and landed somewhere that could only be described as delight. Ethan looked at her. Something in his face opened. "She remembers me," he said. "Of course she does," Sarah said from the stove. "She's very smart." "She's got your eyes now." "She was always going to have my eyes." He picked Clara up, and she grabbed his collar with both hands and looked at him with the severe interrogating focus of an infant conducting a serious evaluation. And he looked back at her with the same seriousness. And Sarah stood at the stove watching them and felt something move through her that she did not try to name. She poured the coffee. She brought it to the table. She sat across from him. He set Clara on his knee and looked at Sarah over the top of Clara's head, and he said simply, "I missed this." She wrapped both hands around her mug, looked at him. "This," she said. "Meaning, this," he said again, gesturing slightly at the cabin at Clara, at her at the whole of it. "This specific thing, that I have not had anywhere else." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about the South Field." He blinked. "The South Field? There's enough cleared now that I could put in a proper kitchen garden come spring, bigger than the one I did this year. But I'd need to turn the soil over the winter, which is more work than I've got hands for." She paused. "If you're going to be around, I could use someone who knows how to handle a plow." He looked at her. He understood she knew. He understood that this was not actually about the plow. "I know how to handle a plow," he said. "Good." She took a drink of her coffee. "Then you can start next week." Clara grabbed Ethan's thumb and squeezed it with the full force of her 7-week-old opinion, and Ethan looked down at her and smiled a full, unguarded smile that Sarah had not seen from him before, that changed his face into something she hadn't known was underneath the careful exterior. And Clara, satisfied with this result, let go and looked around for something else to investigate. Outside, the snow had started. Not hard. Just the first light snow of the season. The kind that didn't stick, but reminded you that the world had more than one face, and you needed to be ready for all of them. Sarah was ready. She looked at the walls she had built, and the hearth she had mortared, and the man sitting at her table holding her daughter, and she understood clearly, without drama, with the same quiet certainty she had felt on the morning she drove out of Denver, that she had built more here than a cabin. She had built a life that was actually hers. And she had built it in the only way that had ever mattered, starting with nothing, refusing every voice that said she couldn't, and laying each piece herself one at a time until the thing standing was something no one could take away. The snow that started falling on the day Ethan came back did not stop for 3 days. Sarah had prepared for it. She had spent October laying in exactly the kind of winter stores that a woman reads about in land guides and then doubles because a land guide is written by someone who survived, and survival always costs more than the estimate. Wood was stacked inside and out. Grain was dry and sealed. The animals she'd acquired in the fall, 2 goats, a pair of chickens that had opinions about everything, and a horse she'd named Margaret after Thomas's sister in St. Louis, which was a private joke she enjoyed, were settled and fed and protected. She was not afraid of snow. But on the second day, when the cold dropped past anything she'd felt since arriving in Wyoming, and the wind found the draft in the north corner, she hadn't fully sealed before the hearing. She understood that she was dealing with something that required more than preparation. It required stubbornness, which she had in abundance, and patience, which she had developed. Ethan had gone back to the Carter Ranch before the storm closed the road. She knew he couldn't come, and she did not wait for him. She pulled on every layer she owned. She wedged timber against the north wall to cut the draft. She kept the fire burning through the night by feeding it in 2-hour rotations, and she held Clara against her chest and walked her back and forth across the finished floor when Clara decided that the storm was interesting enough to stay awake for. "I know," Sarah told her on the second night, somewhere around 2 in the morning, when the wind was making the kind of sound that a wind makes when it has decided to test everything you've built. "I hear it too." Clara was not frightened. She looked toward the north wall with her steady eyes and seemed to be processing the sound with the same methodical attention she gave everything, which was a quality Sarah recognized and intended to encourage. "It's just weather," Sarah said. "The walls are solid. I know they're solid because I built them." Clara looked at her. "I measured twice," Sarah added. Clara appeared satisfied with this and closed her eyes. The walls held. On the morning of the 3rd day, the snow stopped, and the sun came out, and the world was the particular blinding white of a Wyoming winter that you either learned to love or learned to endure. and Sarah stood outside the cabin door with Clara bundled in her arms and looked at her. Land, all of it, the fencing she'd put up along the south boundary, the garden bed under its cover of white, the stacked wood and the animal shelter, and the path worn clear from the cabin to the well, and she felt something she had not quite felt before. Not pride. Something deeper than pride. Permanence. This was hers. Through a storm and a lawsuit and a husband who had come back trying to take it, and a town that had expected her to fail, and winter that had done its honest worst. Still standing. She was still standing. Ethan came 3 days after the thaw, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies from the Carter ranch that she had not asked for and would not refuse. He came through the door with flour and salt pork and a tin of coffee and maize apple preserves, and he set them on the table, and he looked at her with the particular assessing look he'd developed over months of working beside her, checking, not hovering, noticing, not managing. "You weathered it all right," he said. "We did. Draft in the north corner. Handled it. I should have sealed that before." "I sealed it," she said. "Ethan, we're fine." He nodded. But he looked at her for one moment longer, and she could see that what was in his face was not doubt about her capability. He was long past that, but something else. Something that had to do with the 3 days the road was closed, and the 2 days before that, and the particular thing that absence does when you have started to measure your days by a person's presence. She understood it because she had felt it herself and had done what she always did, which was acknowledge it honestly and then get on with the work. "Coffee," she said. "Please." They sat at the table, and Clara demonstrated her new understanding of object permanence by repeatedly dropping a wooden ring off the edge of her blanket and watching it fall with the delighted scientific interest of a researcher who has just discovered something extraordinary about gravity. Ethan watched her do this 4 times. Then he said, "She's going to take the whole place apart when she starts walking." "I'm counting on it," Sarah said. "She should know how everything works from the inside." He looked at Sarah over his coffee. "You planning to teach her construction?" "I'm planning to teach her that there is nothing she cannot figure out if she is willing to learn and willing to work." Sarah paused. "The rest will take care of itself." I was quiet for a moment. "My father said something to me last week." She looked up. "Good something or difficult something?" "Both." He turned his mug in his hands. "He came into the barn while I was working, and he stood there for a while without saying anything. Which with my father means he has something to say and is deciding how to say it." Ethan paused. He said, "She's not going anywhere, is she?" "What did you say?" "I said no, sir. She is not." He met Sarah's eyes. And he said, "Good. A woman who can build a cabin and fight off lawyers and weather a blizzard is exactly the kind of neighbor the Carter Ranch could use." Sarah looked at him. "That is the most indirect compliment I have ever heard." "From William Carter, that is a standing ovation," Ethan said. She laughed. It came out of her before she decided to let it, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she had not produced often enough in the years before Wyoming. Ethan looked at her when she laughed the way he sometimes looked at things he was trying to fix in his memory permanently. She looked back at him and did not look away. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. Her hands stilled around her mug. He set his own mug down. He was not nervous. Ethan was not a nervous man, which was one of the things she trusted about him, but he was deliberate in the way he got when a thing mattered enough that he was not willing to say it wrong. "I'm not going to ask you to need me," he said. "You've made it clear you don't, and I believe you, and I don't want you to. That's not—" He paused. "That's not what I'm looking for." She said nothing. She listened. "What I want," he said, "is to choose you, and to be chosen back. Not because you need saving, and not because I need someone to take care of, but because what we've built here, working together and talking and being honest with each other, is the best thing I've had in my life. And I don't want to be on the outside of it anymore, coming on Thursdays and going home." He looked at her directly. "I want to be here, if you want that." The cabin was quiet. Clara dropped her ring again and watched it fall with great satisfaction. Sarah looked at the man across from her. This man who had come on his father's errand and stayed because he chose to, who had built her daughter a cradle without being asked and stood up in a courthouse at personal cost and written her letters through 8 weeks of a Wyoming winter without ever once implying she should need something she hadn't asked for. She thought about the girl who had walked out of Denver with $156 and a broken-spined building manual. She thought about everything that girl had built since. She thought about what it meant to build something with someone versus building it alone. Not easier, not safer necessarily, but fuller. The way 2 pairs of hands solved problems that one couldn't, and the way that was not a concession to weakness, but an understanding of how things actually worked. She said, "I want you to understand something first." "Tell me." "This is my home," she said. "My land. My daughter. My decisions." She held his gaze. "Those things don't change." "I know. And I will not be managed, not again, not by anyone." "Sarah." His voice was steady and direct. "I have watched you build this place. I have watched you handle a lawsuit and a blizzard and a man who flew in from Denver thinking you were someone he could still control. I have watched you every Thursday for months, and I have never once—" He stopped. Let out a slow breath. "I am not Thomas. I am not my father. I am a man who thinks the most remarkable thing in this county is sitting across from me right now, and who would like nothing more than to be the kind of person worthy of being beside her." He paused. "That is all I'm asking for." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You can move the tools out of the east room." He blinked. "There's enough space," she said, "if you want it." Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, but the particular quality of receiving something you had hoped for and had been too careful to fully expect. "Are you sure?" he said. "I measured twice," she said, and there was the smile. The full one. The one she'd first seen when he looked at Clara, and that she now understood was the truest expression of who he was underneath everything else. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He did not move in that week or the next. There were things that needed doing, first conversations with William Carter, that Ethan handled himself without asking Sarah to be part of them, which she appreciated. Arrangements at the ranch. A conversation with Abbott about the legal standing of their arrangement, because Sarah wanted everything clear and documented, and she was not embarrassed about wanting that. Abbott drew up a cohabitation agreement that protected her land title and her custody arrangement and every material interest she had built. She read it 3 times before she signed it. Ethan signed it without reading it, which made her give him a long look. "I read it," he said. Last night. Abbott sent me a copy." He picked up the pen. "It's good. It protects you. It protects both of us. Mostly you," he said, "which is correct." He signed. "I'm not interested in your land, Sarah. I want to be clear about that." "I know you're not," she said. "The document is for future me. The me that might forget why she trusted someone and need to be reminded of what was agreed." He looked at her. "You really do plan for everything." "I learned to," she said simply. William Carter came to the cabin in February. He came alone without announcement on a gray morning that had the quality of a man who has made up his mind about something and is going to see it through before he loses his nerve. Sarah opened the door when she heard his horse and stood in it the way she'd stood in it the morning Thomas arrived, grounded, prepared, not performing anything. William Carter was a man who had lived a very long time on the principle that the world arranged itself around what he needed. She could see in the way he dismounted and walked to the door that something in that principle had been revised. He stopped at the step. He said, "Mrs. Whitmore." "Mr. Carter," she said. "Come in." He came in. He looked around the cabin with the same assessment he'd used the first time, but the calculation behind it was different now. Less acquisitive. More careful. He sat at the table. She put coffee in front of him. Clara, who was across the room pulling herself up on the side of her cradle, with the ferocious concentration of someone who has decided that upright locomotion is the most important project in the world, did not look up. "She's pulling up," William said. "Since Tuesday," Sarah said. "She'll be walking inside a month." He watched Clara for a moment. "She's got your jaw." Everyone keeps telling me that. William looked at Sarah. My son is going to be next door to useless to me once he's here full time, he said. His attention will be divided. His attention will be his own, Sarah said. That's the point. William's mouth pressed together. Then slowly, it did something she hadn't seen from it before. It relaxed into something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. You don't soften anything, do you? I tried softening things for 6 years in Denver, she said. It cost me more than it saved me. He was quiet for a moment. Ethan tells me you're expanding the South Field this spring. I am. You're going to need to break that ground before April if you want it ready. I know. Carter Ranch has a 3-bottom plow that sits idle in winter. He said it the way he said everything, like a fact. He was reporting with no implication about what she should do with it. You're welcome to use it. She looked at him. She understood that this was William Carter's version of what Ethan had been doing since September, showing up, offering what he had, leaving the decision entirely to her. Thank you, she said. I'll have Ethan bring it over when the ground softens. William nodded. He drank his coffee. He looked at Clara, who had achieved a standing position against the cradle, and was regarding the distance between herself and the table, with the expression of a general assessing difficult terrain. She's going to be stubborn, he said. Of course she is, Sarah said. She's mine. William Carter looked at her with something she had not expected, and could not quite name something that was. She thought the nearest thing to respect, that he knew how to show a woman he had not chosen to respect, and had arrived at it anyway, through evidence, because that was the only route that worked on a man like him. He set down his mug. He stood up. Good coffee, he said. Thank you. He put on his hat, walked to the door, stopped. My wife, he said, and his voice changed slightly on the word lower, something tighter in it. She was a hard woman. People didn't always like her for it. She didn't care. He was quiet for a moment. She built this family. Everything that's called Carter in this county started with what she built. He paused. I thought you should know I understand the difference between a hard woman and a wrong one. He walked out. She heard him right away. She stood in the middle of her cabin, and she felt the weight of what he'd said settle into her slowly, the way things do when they are true. And you have needed them to be said, and did not know you needed it until they were. Clara chose that moment to take her first step. Just one from the side of the cradle to the table leg, a distance of maybe 18 inches, executed with the concentration of someone who has spent weeks calculating this exact maneuver and is finally ready to execute it. She made it. She grabbed the table leg. She looked at her mother, and Sarah crossed the room and went to her knees on the floor. She had sealed herself and gathered her daughter up and held her, and she said into the top of Clara's head, There you go, there you go. Spring came the way it comes to Wyoming. Suddenly, and without apology, the ground going from frozen to soft in the space of 10 days, the creek running fast with snowmelt. The air carrying the particular smell that Sarah had discovered over the winter she loved above almost any other. The south field broke open under the Carter 3-bottom plow, with Ethan driving it in long, clean rows while Sarah walked the edge and marked where she wanted the kitchen garden to begin, and where she wanted the longer rows for the field crops. She had planned it through the winter. She had drawn it on paper, the rotation, the spacing, the drainage. She had read 2 books on dryland farming that Ruby had sourced from the library in Cheyenne. She had corresponded with a woman in Nebraska who had been homesteading for 11 years, and who wrote back with the frank, useful practicality of someone with no patience for anything but what worked. Ethan watched her mark the field, and said nothing except what was useful, which was his great gift. At noon, they ate at the cabin. Sarah and Ethan and Clara, who ate mashed carrots with the serious dedication of someone fueling an important project, and who looked up at Ethan periodically and said the sound that she had been producing for 2 weeks, that had recently started sounding very specifically like a word. He had not said anything about it. Sarah had not said anything about it. But on that particular Tuesday in April, Clara looked directly at Ethan across the table and said it clearly enough that there was no ambiguity left. Da. The room went quiet. Ethan's face did something complicated. Sarah watched at the sequence of things moving through it, each one true. None of them easy, all of them sitting alongside each other the way real things do. He looked at Sarah. She looked back at him. She hears what she hears, Sarah said quietly. She decides what she decides. He looked back at Clara, who was looking at him with the absolute confidence of a 10-month-old, who has decided that the word she has chosen is the correct one and does not expect to be contradicted. He said, "Hi, sweetheart." Clara banged her spoon on the table in approval. Sarah looked at her daughter, and at this man, and at the table in the cabin she had built, and she understood that life did not announce its most important moments in advance. They arrived in the middle of ordinary days, between rows in a field, over a table with carrot-stained hands, in the word of a child who had not yet learned that some things were supposed to be complicated. Cedar Ridge changed its story that year. Not all at once. Not with any admission. Towns do not admit when they are wrong about people. They simply begin telling a different version of events in which they were never quite as wrong as they were. Martha Hensley was the first. She came to the cabin in May with a jar of her own preserves, not as a gesture of charity, but as a transaction between women who were both serious about their gardens, and she stood in the doorway and looked at what Sarah had built, and she said with the particular grace of a woman who has had to revise herself, "You have done something here." "Yes," Sarah said, "I have." "I wasn't sure you would." "I know you weren't." Martha looked at her. "I should have been more—" She stopped, started again. "I could have been more useful to you when you arrived." "You could have," Sarah agreed. "But I managed." "You did." Martha held out the preserves. "These are better than May Carter's. Don't tell her I said so." Sarah took the jar. "Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." Martha came in. Clara immediately crawled to her boots and sat on them, which was her current method of making acquaintance with anyone who entered. Martha looked down at her, and something shifted in her face. "She's a serious child," Martha said. "She is," Sarah said. "She takes after me." Ruby Oaks said in the summer, on one of her Tuesday visits that had become the fixed point of Sarah's week. "You know, people tell the story of you now." Sarah was washing jars at the basin. "What story?" "The pregnant woman who came with a hammer and built herself a life." Ruby was holding Clara on her hip, and Clara was trying to take Ruby's braid apart with the methodical focus she brought to all engineering problems. "They tell it like they admired you from the beginning. Did you correct them?" Ruby smiled. "I let them tell it. Because here is the thing about people, Sarah, they want to be on the right side. They just don't always know which side that is until it's settled." She paused. "It's settled now." Sarah dried her hands. "Does it bother you?" Ruby asked. "That they're claiming it now that it's done?" Sarah thought about it honestly. "A little," she said. "Less than it would have a year ago." She looked out the window at her field, at the rows she'd planted, and the things growing in them. "I know what it cost. I know who was there. That doesn't change because they're telling it differently now." Ruby nodded. "No, it doesn't." On a Saturday evening in August, Ethan asked her to marry him. He did not do it with ceremony or with a prepared speech. He did it the way he did most things, directly in the middle of something else, because he was not a man who believed that the most important things required an elaborate stage. They were sitting on the step outside the cabin in the long summer evening. Clara asleep inside, the day finished, and the animals settled, and the field in that particular state of early evening stillness that Sarah had come to love more than almost anything else in her life. He said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "Ask." "Will you marry me?" Not "will you" with an inflection of uncertainty. "Will you" as a question that was also underneath a statement of intention, as if he had already decided the direction and was asking her to confirm they were walking the same way. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what the word meant to her now after everything. What it had meant before the loss of herself, slow and complete, and done with kindness, which made it harder to name and harder to fight. What it would mean now with this man, with the agreement Abbott had drawn up and the land title in her name, and Clara, who said what she meant and chose what she chose. She thought about building. She thought about how the best things she had built, the walls, the floor, the field, the life she had built, knowing that a foundation was not a limitation. It was what made height possible. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes. Yes." She looked back at the field. "We'll need another room. Clara's going to need her own space when she's older, and you take up more of the east room than you think you do." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I take up a reasonable amount of space. You have opinions about where things go." "One opinion, about the boot rack. The boot rack is in the wrong place. The boot rack is in the place where I can actually use it." "We'll build another room," she said, "and we can fight about the boot rack in the new one." He looked at her with the full weight of his regard, and then he said, "I love you, Sarah." She looked back at him. She let the words land where they were meant to land, which was somewhere deep and permanent in the part of her that had not been spoken to honestly for so long that she had almost forgotten the sound of it. "I know," she said. "And then, I love you too." He put his arm around her. She did not lean into it immediately. She sat with herself for a moment, the way she always did, making sure she was choosing this and not simply falling into it. Then she leaned, and they sat together in the long Wyoming evening, and the field held its rows, and the cabin held its walls, and Clara slept inside the home her mother had built before she was born. 1 year after Sarah Whitmore drove up this road alone with a suitcase and a building manual and 40 acres of nothing. The woman who had been expected to fail was sitting on the step of a home she had built on land that was hers, beside a man she had chosen with a daughter inside, who had already taken 15 steps in a single afternoon, and who approached the world with the forward, unafraid confidence of someone who had never once been told she couldn't. Cedar Ridge told the story of her differently now. They said it with something that wanted to sound like pride, and Sarah let them say it, because what they believed about themselves was their business, and what she knew about herself was hers. What she knew was this: she had arrived with nothing but her own 2 hands, and her refusal to be what anyone else decided she should be. She had built every wall herself. She had stayed through the cold and the lawsuit and the whispers, and the man who came from Denver to take back what he'd never really owned. She had made every decision. She had done the work. And the life standing around her now, the home, the field, the daughter, the man, the permanence of it, every inch of it was hers because she had built it. Not because someone gave it to her. Not because someone saved her. Because she had decided on a morning in the spring of 1885, with $156 and a broken-spined building manual, that she was worth building for. And she had